This is lecture 58A in the series The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, and our subject is the Philippines, specifically primitive communism in the Philippines in this lecture, Marxism, language, and culture, because we have two different ways of looking at history, and our way, I think, will be quite different than the normal way you would take if you were studying in a university the history of the Philippines, because we have quite different purposes to serve here. We're going to switch momentarily to the map of the Philippines so you can refresh your knowledge of what it looks like. The geology of the Philippines is more complex than we have dealt with in the last number of lectures. The most complex probably since we studied the history of Northwest North America geologically. The Philippines is a collage of what are called metamorphic terraces, magmatic arcs, ophiolitic complexes, sedimentary basins, and a continental block of nearby Asia. This collage had been subjected to tectonic subduction, collision, and strike-slip faulting. The west-dipping Philippine Trench traverses the eastern seaboard of the Philippines from Mindanao up to Luzon. East-dipping are the Manila Trench, Negros Trench, and Cotabato Trench. The southern termination of the Manila Trench is subducted by the South China Sea Plate, thus forming an arc-continent collisional deformation within Mindoro Island, northern Palawan, southern Mindoro, sitting on top of the continental block. The Romblon Island Group and the Buruanga Peninsula in Panay Island of North Palawan Block are of the late Permian and Jurassic in age. The rest of the archipelago is the Philippine Mobile Belt that ages from Jurassic to early Paleogene. The ophiolites are hosts to significant deposits of chromite and nickel. Laterites contain economic deposits of secondary nickel minerals. Gold and copper deposits in the Philippines are clustered in certain areas such as the Luzon Central Cordillera, the Camarines Norte, the Surigao and Davao, with large deposits elsewhere. The Zambales de Zone Mine, Cebu Atlas Mine, and South Cotabato Tampacan mines are current exploitation sites. Many copper-gold deposits are associated with intrusions, as well as Pleistocene volcanism, such as the Lepanto mine at Mankayan, Benguet. Iron deposits are also associated with Neogene intrusions of diorite and quartz diorite. The archaeological prehistory of the Philippines currently begins with the arrival of humans by boat at least 67,000 years ago. We know this from the 2007 discovery of Callao Man at Cagayan. Callao Man is a Homo sapiens metatarsal discovered in Callao Cave, Peña Blanca, Cagayan, Philippines by Armand Salvador Mijares. The 61 millimeter metatarsal was dated by uranium series to be 67,000 years old. On the other hand, glottochronologically, a term I'll explain shortly, Philippines prehistory begins some 90,000 years ago. At any rate, the Neolithic-aged Angono petroglyphs found in Rizal, Angono, Linangonan, and Antipolo, Rizal, overlie evidence for the presence of early human settlement, that is, an occupation before the arrival of the Negritos and Austronesian-speaking people. After the Rizal early occupation, these hunter-gatherers inhabited the Philippine Islands. Butchered animal remains in the same sedimentary layer prove that Callao Man represents a population that used stone tools to hunt and prepare deer, Cervus marianus, wild pigs, and an extinct type of cattle. In the 1960s, Robert Fox led a 6-year archaeological research project focusing on the caves and rock shelters at Lipun Point in the southern part of Palawan Island. The most important are the Taban Cave Complex, where the large main cave produced Pleistocene human fossils. These fossil finds include a skull cap, jaw bones, teeth, and several other fragmented bones from more than one person. Radiometric dating gives us a range of dates from 16,500 BP for the young female skull cap to 31,000 BP for a right mandible and 48,000 years ago for a tibia fragment. The Tabone Cave was a Stone Age factory with both finished stone flake tools and waste core flakes recovered from 4 separate levels in the main chamber, whose cooking fires date to 7,000, 20,000, and 22,000 BP. Fox concluded that the Tabone Cave was a human habitation site from 50,000 to 9,000 years ago. The Tabone Cave was named after the Tabone bird, or Tabone scrubfall Megapodius comingii, which deposited thick, hard layers of guano during periods when the cave was uninhabited, so that succeeding groups of tool makers settled on a cement-like floor of bird dung. About half of the 3,000 recovered specimens examined were discarded stone tool cores of a rock which had to be transported from some distance away. The Tabone Cave Complex is a series of caves situated in a limestone promontory at Lipun Point in southwestern Palawan. It is 25 million years old and composed of rocky large domes, deep cliffs, and steep hills. It spans 180 acres that used to be an island but is now a mangrove forest connected to mainland Palawan. These are roughly 218 caves, 38 of which are rich with archaeological finds. In this area, cave occupation was of a sporadic or temporary nature before 9000 BP. Several later sites show more intensive or frequent occupation, with broad-spectrum wild resource exploiting people using land, riverine, estuarine, and ocean resources. The lack of marine shells in Tabone Cave early cultural deposits indicate that there was a substantial land shelf around the time of the last glacial maximum, approximately 22,000 years BP. At that time, sea levels were 130 meters or more below their present level. Marine shells appear in other caves on Lipun Point from 7,000 BP onwards. The abandonment of Tabone Cave occurred with rising sea levels. The potential relationship between Tabone Cave travertine and pre-late glacial maximum wetter climates is supported by recent research on vegetation sequences in North Palawan. Tabone Cave would have been far inland during the late Pleistocene, and such caves would have been marginally useful during phases of low sea level when currently submerged areas would have been the focus for human settlement. In the Tabone Caves, chert flakes and chopping tools of early food gatherers and hunters were found, and chert was readily available from the riverbanks near the caves. Early people lived and knapped flake tools inside the Tabone Cave. In later occupations, earthenware has been found in different caves from the Tabone complex. In the Liang Cave, large jars filled with human remains were discovered. The Negritos were early settlers, followed by speakers of the Malayo-Polynesian languages, a branch of the Austronesian language family. The latter began to arrive in successive waves beginning around 6000 BP. Austronesian speakers were in Indochina, as were the Hemudu and later people from the Liangzhu and Dapin King of Neolithic China. During the Philippines Neolithic period, a jade culture with tens of thousands of exquisitely crafted jade artifacts is dated to 4000 BP. The jade itself originated nearby in Taiwan and is found in many other areas in insular and mainland Indochina. These artifacts are evidence of long-distance contact between prehistoric Indo-Chinese and neighboring Southeast Asian societies. Now a comment about the mortuary practices. The custom of jar burial, which ranges from Sri Lanka to the Plain of Jars in Laos to Japan, also was practiced in the Tabone Caves. A most spectacular example of a secondary burial jar is in the National Museum. It is a jar with a lid topped with two figures. One is deceased with arms crossed, hands touching the shoulder. The other is a steersman. Both are seated in a proa, a type of multi-hull sailboat. It is a vessel consisting of two usually unequal lengths, parallel hulls, with only the mast missing from the piece. Secondary burial was practiced across all the islands of the Philippines during this period. The bones are reburied, some in the burial jars. 78 earthenware vessels were recovered from the Manangul cave on Palawan specifically for burial. Now, Austronesian speakers arrived between 7000 and 4000 BP. Historian William Henry Scott says, based on glottochronological analysis of the 7 million word pairs, linguist Isidore Dayan published in 1962, that there are two alternative scenarios explaining the origin and spread of Austronesian languages. The first is that they originated in sub-Pacific Island and spread westward to Asia. The second is that they originated in Taiwan and spread southward. Considering the second alternative the most hypothetically plausible, Scott concluded those Austronesian speakers as long ago as 7000 BP introduced the Philippines language tree. Their descendants spread through the Philippines archipelago, absorbing autochthonous tribal agricultural stage populations, their Austronesian language diversifying into dozens of mutually unintelligible languages. Then other Austronesian speakers entered the Philippines. All modern Philippine languages except the Samambaja languages originated within the archipelago. In other words, none of the indigenous languages have been introduced by migrations subsequent to the second Austronesian arrival. All contemporary indigenous languages having more in common with each other than with languages outside of the Philippines. Tribal Austronesian arrivals occurred during the Philippines' Neolithic period of the tribal agricultural stage of sociocultural evolution. Archaeologically, the Philippines are defined by the jade culture. Tens of thousands of these exquisitely crafted jade artifacts have been recovered from sites in the Batangas province. Now we come to Morris Swadesh lexicostatistics and glottochronology. The just mentioned glottochronological analysis is the product of research and development by the Marxist professor Morris Swadesh. Swadesh was born January 22, 1909 and died July 20th in 1967. He was a pioneering Marxist theoretician specializing in anthropological linguistics. In the early 1800s, linguists began to comprehend the interrelations of the larger Indo-European family of languages. By the late 1800s, linguists were using these principles to identify word similarities and propose language families among the indigenous languages of the Americas. In the 1930s, Morris Swadesh was part of a new generation of linguists developing these insights in greater depth. Swadesh began by applying the concepts of historical linguistics to the indigenous languages of the Americas. What exactly were these concepts? In Europe, there was an established and very clear pattern of language change over centuries. The study of that pattern was called historical linguistics. Specifically, it was the study of the shift from Latin to the Romance languages of French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and Spanish that had occurred in Europe in fewer than 2,000 years, and because these languages were written, scholars could gauge the rate of change. Now, Swadesh went on to prove that all languages change according to laws. These laws are applicable to all languages. He spent his professional life comparing the hundreds of ethnographic indigenous languages of the Americas, and he was able to chart or map their degrees of conductivity and descent. Theoretically, Swadesh had the advantage of being a Marxist and followed the intellectual lead of Joseph Stalin. Stalin had taken on the Russian linguist N.Y. Marr in 1950, demonstrating that the study of language and culture had to be bipartite. This was true because language is, in and of its origin and evolution, independent of the ideological sphere of culture, although intimately intertwined with it. We have discussed the correct placement of the ability to speak in linguistic terms of phonemes, morphemes, and Words in Human Physical Evolution in the early chapters of Volume 1 of this textbook. That temporal placement and the causal and processual analysis upon which it relies has been the product of Marxist analysis that begins with the work of Stalin and Swadesh. Accordingly, the subject is worth the digression now. Stalin on Marxism and Linguistics was an article published in June 20th, July 4th, and August 20th, 1950 issues of Pravda, and published under the title of Marxism and Problems of Linguistics by J.V. Stalin. And there's currently on reference in the Marxist.org Stalin Reference Archive 2000, a online version of it. And I quote, "A group of younger comrades has asked me to give my opinion in the press on problems relating to linguistics, particularly in reference to Marxism in linguistics. I am not a linguistic expert and, of course, cannot fully satisfy the request of the comrades. As to Marxism in linguistics, as in other social sciences, this is something directly in my field. I have therefore consented to answer a number of questions put by the comrades. The first question asked by the interviewer is it true that language is a superstructure on the base? Stalin's answer is, no, it is not true. The base is the economic structure of society at the given stage of its development. The superstructure is the political, legal, religious, artistic, philosophical views of society and the political, legal, and other institutions corresponding to them. Every base has its own corresponding superstructure. The base of the feudal system has its superstructure, its political, legal, and other views, and the corresponding institutions. The capitalist base has its own superstructure, so has the socialist base. If the base changes or is eliminated, then following this, its superstructure changes or is eliminated. If a new base arises, then following this, a superstructure arises corresponding to it. In this respect, language radically differs from the superstructure. Take, for example, Russian society and the Russian language. In the course of the past 30 years, the old capitalist base has been eliminated in Russia, and a new socialist base has been built. Correspondingly, the superstructure of the capitalist base has been eliminated, and a new superstructure created corresponding to the socialist base. The old political, legal, and other institutions, consequently, have been supplanted by new socialist institutions. But in spite of this, the Russian language has remained what it was before the October Revolution. It is no secret to anyone that the Russian language served Russian capitalism and Russian bourgeois culture before the October Revolution, just as well as it now serves the socialist system and the socialist culture of Russian society. The same must be said of the Ukrainian, Belarusian, Uzbek, Kazakh, Georgian, Armenian, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Moldavian, Tatar, Azerbaijanian, Bashkirian, Turkmenian, and other languages of the Soviet nations. They served the old bourgeois system of these nations just as well as they serve the new socialist system. It cannot be otherwise. Language was created precisely in order to serve society as a whole. It is a means of intercourse between people, in order to be common to the members of society and constitute the single language of society. It serves members of society equally, irrespective of their class status. A language has only to depart from this position of being a language common to the whole people. It has only to give preference and support to some one social group to the detriment of other social groups of the society to lose its virtue. If it departs from this service, it ceases to be a means of intercourse between the people of the society and becomes the jargon of some social group, degenerates, and is doomed to disappear. In this respect, while language differs in principle from the superstructure, language does not differ from instruments of production, for example, from machines. Machines are as indifferent to classes as is language. They may equally serve a capitalist system and a socialist system. Furthermore, a superstructure is the product of one epoch, the epoch in which the given economic base or mode of production exists and operates. Any specific superstructure is therefore short-lived. It is eliminated and disappears with the elimination and disappearance of the given base. Language, on the contrary, is the product of a whole number of epochs. In the course of several epochs, it has taken shape, become enriched, develops, and is smoothened. A language thereby lives immeasurably longer than any base or any superstructure. This, in fact, explains why the rise and elimination not only of one base and its superstructure, but of several bases and their corresponding superstructures have not led in history to the elimination of a given language, to the elimination of its structure, and the rise of a new language with a new stock of words and a new grammatical system." Unquote. Now, back at the ranch, in the late 1930s, Morris Swadesh worked in Mexico with its government as it tried to preserve some of the indigenous languages of Mexico. After the U.S. entered World War II, Swadesh returned to the U.S. and worked on military projects for the U.S. Army and the Office of Strategic Services. In the post-World War II years, as the Truman Gang prepared to attack the Soviet Union and the Cold War hysterical propaganda reached new heights, Swadesh was fired from City College of New York because he was a communist. By 1949, he had been blacklisted in U.S. academia and forced to escape the United States for Mexico City, one step ahead of the FBI. For one detailed exposition, I recommend David Price's 2004 book, Threatening Anthropology, McCarthyism and the FBI's Surveillance of Active Anthropologists, published by Duke University Press. At any rate, by 1956, Swadesh had been working at the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, and then he was hired as a full-time researcher at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He taught at the National School of Anthropology and History, or Escuela Nacional de Antropología e Historia, and lived in Mexico City. In 1962, I first met him in the circle of refugee U.S. communists who resided close to UNAM and took weekends in Cuernavaca. At that time, I had no idea that I would soon be using his pioneering research in my own study of early human migrations into the New World, that study being 1969 and 1970 doctoral research undertaken in my Ice Mountain archaeological expedition to the Stikine-Tahltan River drainages of far northern subarctic British Columbia. In 1966, Morris Swadesh was appointed Professor of General Linguistics at the University of Alberta at Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. He was developing plans for a major research project in Western Canada at the time of his death in the summer of 1967. Now, as to glottochronology, that is the part of lexicostatistics dealing with the chronological relationship between languages. Theoretically, glottochronology is based on the Marxist general theory that all human languages are identical in structure. That is, structurally, all languages are based on the human vocal ability to repeat distinct units of sound called phonemes. These phonemes are then grouped into distinct units of meaning called morphemes. And morphemes, if they are not already units called words, are then grouped into words. The physical ability to vocalize phonemes is one of the first diagnostic traits separating human-like or hominid traits from ape-like or hominoid traits in the biological evolutionary record of the genus Homo. This scientific general theory has two methodological assumptions. The first is that a relatively stable basic vocabulary exists in all human languages and is now referred to as the Swadesh lists. The second is that replacements of words happen in constant percentages per time elapsed. Swadesh's technique is glottochronology. Now, as to word lists, the core vocabulary of a language is replaced at a constant average rate across all languages and cultures, and can therefore be used to measure the passage of time. Morris Swadesh compiled lists of lexical terms based on their resistance to borrowing. Originally designed in 1952, Swadesh had a list of 200 items. In 1955, Swadesh refined his list into 100 words. In either case, the core vocabulary was designed to encompass concepts common to every human language, These include such personal pronouns, body parts, heavenly bodies, verbs of basic actions, numerals 1 and 2, to eliminate concepts that are specific to a particular culture or time. Now in practice, this ideal is not always possible. Thus the meanings may need to be tailored to the languages being compared, and accordingly alternative word lists have been compiled using specifically fewer meaning slots. But at any rate, the percentage of cognate words that have a common origin in these word lists is then measured. The larger the percentage of cognates, the more recently the two languages being compared have been separated. There is such a thing as the glottochronological constant. Robert Lees obtained a value for the glottochronological constant of R of words by considering the known changes in 13 pairs of languages using the 200 word list. He obtained a value of 0.805 plus or minus with 90% confidence, and for the 100 word list, Swadesh obtained a value of 0.86, the higher value reflecting the elimination of semantically unstable words. This constant may be related to the retention rate of words by. I'm not going to repeat it here because it's in your book and then you can read it more clearly, the actual equation or formula, where L is the rate of replacement. In it is the logarithm, IN is the logarithm to base E, and R is the glottochronological constant. There is such a thing as divergence time, and the basic formula of glottochronology in its shortest form is, and again you can read it in your book where you get it, the equation, where T equals a given period from one stage of the language to another, C equals the proportion of word list items retained at the end of the period, and L equals the rate of replacement for that word list. One can also therefore formulate the following, and I give that equation. By testing historically verifiable cases where we have knowledge of T through non-linguistic data, as in the historical distance from classical Latin to modern Romance languages, Swadesh derived an empirical value. He calculated approximately 0.14 for L. This means that the rate of replacement constitutes around 14 words from the 100 word list per 1,000 years. Now, back to the Philippines. Origins of contemporary ethnic groups, advanced theocratic chiefdoms, and class-state societies. The islands of the Philippines are inhabited by more than 175 ethno-linguistic nationalities. Glottochronology proves that the majorities are Austronesian in origin. These ethno-linguistic nationalities include the Ivatan, Ilocano, Pangasinan, Kempangan, Tagalog, Bicolano, and Visayans. Visayan includes the Masbateño, Ilonggo, Cebuano, Waray, Butuanon, Romblo-Manon, Camayo, Cunyon, and Suriganonon. Finally, there are the ethno-linguistic minorities, these being mainly the Zamboangueño and Subanon, although there are many more, and it is for this reason that glottochronology and lexicostatistics are so important in the study of the Philippines. The Negritos are a pre-Austronesian people who had migrated from mainland Asia and were one of the earliest humans to settle in the Philippines. Glottochronologically, we think they arrived around 90,000 years ago, although, as we have seen archaeologically, the first known arrivals appear by 67,000 BP in the form of Callao man remains. The Negrito population in 2004 was 31,000, and their tribal groups include the Ati and Eta. Their lives remain mostly free from Western and Islamic influences. Most Filipinos are Malayo-Polynesian, a major family within the Austronesian language family. Other ethno-linguistic nations form a minority in the Philippine population. These include those of Japanese, Chinese, particularly the Hokkien and Cantonese, and Indians of the Punjab. Ethnicities such as the Tamil and Kerala, English, Castilian, and other ethno-linguistic nations from other countries are contemporary occupants. Accordingly, there are mixed ethnicity individuals called mestizo throughout the islands. And this has given rise, as many of you know, to an extraordinarily good-looking population that ranges in size from, among females, the Miss Universe type of Ismelda Marcos to the actress type of Charmaine Starr, which is very small or petite. At any rate, and the male counterparts are pretty well known because of the boxing tradition that has brought many Filipino men to the world of the wider world because of their boxing prowess. At any rate, a 2008 genetic study showed no evidence of large-scale Taiwanese migration into the Philippines. The Leeds University study, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, showed that mitochondrial DNA lineages have been evolving within island Southeast Asia since modern humans arrived approximately 50,000 years ago. There is no genetic evidence for large-scale population replacement, displacement, or absorption to suggest replacement of pre-existing hunting and gathering populations by farming voyaging immigrants from Taiwan. Population dispersals occurred at the same time as sea level rose, which resulted in migrations from the Philippines to as far north as Taiwan within the last 10,000 years. During the period 15,000 to 7,000 years ago, following the last ice age, rising sea levels occurred in 3 massive pulses. Each of these pulses caused flooding and submergence of the Sunda Peninsula. From these events, the Java and South China Seas and their thousands of islands took up the configuration that is Indonesia and the Philippines today. Examination of mitochondrial DNA lineages showed that the Neolithic culture of Austronesian-speaking people had been evolving within island Southeast Asia since before 7000 BP. And with that, I'm going to conclude this first lecture on primitive communism, linguistics, language and culture, Stalin and Morris Swadesh, and next time we will be moving on to the chiefdoms of the Philippine Islands.